Welcome to worship at Cincinnati Friends Meeting. I'm Jim Newby, a minister and public friend at the meeting. Our worship this morning will consist of a brief message by me, followed by a time of meditative silence, or what Quakers call open worship. The silence will be broken by Dick Patterson, a member of ministry council, and my companion on the facing bench this morning. He will be asking about joys and concerns. For those of you in the meeting house, if you are led to speak out of the silence, please stand and the microphone will be brought to you. Please be sure to introduce yourself for our Zoom participants. And for those of you who are Zoom participants who feel led to speak, please introduce yourself so that those of us here in the meeting room will know who is speaking. The scripture passage on which I'd like to focus this morning comes from Genesis, chapter 32. The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched the hollow of his thigh. And Jacob's thigh was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." I've been thinking about my father in recent days. This is the time of year that he died, and his physical absence from the family Thanksgiving table last Thursday accentuated how much I miss him. Although he passed away many years ago, the memories of his life and his influence on me remain vivid. You see, my father was the personification of what you would call a very successful minister. He put church and community and his fellow humans above himself, and he never deviated from that path. Unfortunately, there were also many times that he put others above his own family. His statement, "I'm married to the church," was something that I would hear throughout my growing years. In an editorial in the Muncie, Indiana Star newspaper on the day of his memorial service, the editor wrote about my father, a piece that I have framed and hanging in my study at home. He said, "Newby died last week at the comparatively young age of 62. Yet his record of accomplishments is long and distinguished. He accumulated that record by never flinching from accepting responsibility, regardless of whether the request was from his church, his community, or from the downtrodden and less fortunate who sought his counsel and his friendship. He was a thoughtful and inspiring speaker. His sermons were carefully researched and meticulous in their preparation. 2 published volumes of those sermons remain as his legacy. Also, part of that legacy is the affection that he engendered in those who knew him and the respect in which he was held by his church and his community. No person can expect more than that. My father was a man of principles and integrity. When he served as the chair of the Muncie, Indiana Human Relations Council, he worked hard to integrate local businesses and tone down the racist rhetoric in a community that was racially divided. My favorite story of his acting on his principles was the time that he confronted a man who was flying a Confederate flag from his front porch. I was a young boy, traveling with him down Madison Avenue, when suddenly he stopped the car, told me to stay seated, while he walked up to the front door of a rather scary-looking house. A man came to the door and my father started talking to him. After a few minutes, my father returned to the car and the man at the house started to take down the Confederate flag that he was flying. I asked my father what he had said, and he replied, "I just told the man that that flag he was flying on his front porch represented a lot of hurt in our country. And to a large segment of our community, the flag stood for slavery and hatred. I told him that he had every right to fly it, but it would help settle some of the racial tensions in our community if he took it down." Surprisingly, and out of respect for my father and what he said, the man took it down. My father was not a man of wealth, and although we never knew it, he reared his family just above the poverty line. One of the perks in his ministry at the Minneapolis Friends meeting was that he and his family had first takes on the clothing that was put into the missionary barrel for shipment to Kenya. As I got older, I felt guilty about wearing clothes that some poor African child could have been wearing. He was a Quaker minister and a Quaker pacifist, never flinching from his heartfelt belief that Jesus was right when he taught his followers to love your enemies. He was a conscientious objector during World War II, which was a courageous position to take in those days, often resulting in him being ostracized and/or beaten by those who disagreed with his position. He was a man who as a child experienced near death as a result of scarlet fever and rheumatic fever. He would tell the story of being in his bed sick and hearing the doctor outside his room telling his mother to prepare for his death. And yet he survived, for which I'm personally grateful. His childhood was not a happy one. Due to his illnesses, he was absent from school for long periods of time. Thus, he had no real close friends. Each Valentine's Day, as we were growing up, he would repeat the sad story about being in his classroom while all of the children in his class were exchanging Valentine's cards, and he did not receive one. The lesson for his own children: make sure that we had cards for everyone in our class. There was also the time as a young boy when he was standing by the edge of the field watching a group of boys play football. Because of his unhealthy heart, he was never allowed to play sports, but he loved to watch. On this particular occasion, as the boys broke from their huddle, they all came running over to tackle my father and to beat him. A sad childhood indeed. My father was greatly influenced by his grandfather, who lived with my father and family after the death of his wife, my father's grandmother. His grandfather was a famous minister among Quakers and was a yearly meeting superintendent to 4 different yearly meetings, a record which stands to this day. My father would often go with his grandfather when he would travel to various meetings to speak. On one particular occasion, my father mustered all of the courage that he could muster and told his grandfather that he shouldn't preach so long. He told him, you know, when 12 o'clock noon arrives, people want to go home for lunch. And as the story goes, his grandfather did not say a word in response until he was preaching, and the noon hour arrived. He stopped preaching, looked up from his notes and said, Now, there's a young man here in the congregation who's hungry, and so we'll wait for him to get up and leave for lunch, and then I'll continue my message. According to my father, he just sat there embarrassed that he never again questioned the length of his grandfather's sermons. The spirituality of remembrance. The stories, the memories, the pictures in the mind are all there. And they are especially vivid during this time of year. The holidays have a tendency to evoke these memories of family, both good and bad. I know that I'm a Quaker minister because of my father's influence. Each week while at home, I would sit in his congregation listening to his sermons, and when he wasn't looking, I would mimic his preaching style. At the time of his death, he had written 2 books of sermons, Spiritual Fire and Life is to be Celebrated. We knew that we loved each other, my father and I. We just never said that we loved each other. And before this neglect could be corrected, he was gone. The scripture passage in Genesis, which I shared this morning, are those famous verses about Jacob wrestling with God. There's one particular line that is especially meaningful to me. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." I will not let you go unless you bless me. Friends, how many sons and how many daughters have felt this same way about their own mothers and fathers? All children want the blessing of their parents, and seeking that blessing can at times feel like a wrestling match. I will not let you go unless you bless me. And so this morning, I encourage those of you who are fathers and mothers to bless your children. And those of you who were children, be forgiving of your parents. I know that I need forgiveness. And I know that my father needs it as well. As I said, my father is no longer living on this earth. And I know that this is the case for many of you. Some of his words, however, live on in his writings. And I want to close this message this morning, this message of remembrance, with my father's own words that are found in his message, The Triumph of Spirit Over Body. He writes, "We cannot find full answers to the questions of life, death, pain, and evil, for they are mysteries of God. Yet it should be our faith that God's love is greater than any other force known to humans. And we believe that we are bound together by that force now and through eternity. It is this divine love that will ever keep dear loved ones and friends with us, even though invisible. We can join hands with them, for there is no separation in God's family."